The American soldier, what makes him so great in combat is the mere fact that he uses his initiative. This is what makes the American soldier a greater fighting man than any foreign army that you can name. The American soldier will do anything. But the American soldier wants to know why.
I remember the problems of democracy teacher. He came into the classroom and he was all upset that there was a coup in South Vietnam. And this gentleman was killed and there's a change in government. And we looked at each other and I said, you know, where the hell's South Vietnam? You gotta be kidding me. A coup, who cares? Who would ever in our wildest dreams think that a few years later that I would be leading men into battle in South Vietnam, in Cambodia? I didn't even know where it was.
Kiss me goodbye and write me I'm gone. Goodbye, my sweetheart, hell Vietnam.
I was on a fast-moving train that I couldn't get off of and I couldn't slow down. And it was taking me someplace I didn't want to go. And I was scared. And once I got there, I was taken aside, as were a lot of the soldiers, and told to write a will. It was a requirement that you write a will, so they knew where to dispose of your property should you be killed. When I wrote that will, I decided I was a dead man.
Son of a bitch wounded me, goddammit. Okay, so, if I don't make it, just wish me luck, okay?
Once I entered the country, I found myself in the position of being a platoon leader for a platoon of seasoned soldiers who had been there some time before me. And the big question was not about the politics of the war, but was I going to be an effective leader and not get them hurt?
Saying, O Lord, to rescue me, let all be put to shame and confusion who seek to snatch away my life. Deign, O Lord, to rescue me. Amen.
This whole notion of a domino theory was very real to me, that sooner or later, if the communists weren't stopped in Vietnam, sooner or later they'd get to our country. That was not, for me and for a great many people, that was not an abstraction. That's what we were fighting for in Vietnam. What do I think of it now? I mean, it's, you know, it was absurd.
Vietnam, 1965. Early moments in the single most critical event of the 1960s. Within 3 short years, this faraway war would touch off a rebellion in America. Young political activists, already concerned with issues like civil rights and free speech, would confront the government directly. At the same time, members of the counterculture would turn their backs on American society. And young blacks trapped in inner-city ghettos would rebel against an America that seemingly cared more about freedom in Southeast Asia than freedom at home. Together, these rebels would challenge America's fundamental assumptions about democracy and patriotism, and create a climate of revolution unknown in America since the Civil War. In 1964, America was optimistic about its future. Democrat Lyndon Baines Johnson was about to be elected president by one of the biggest landslides in U.S. history, thanks to a coalition of voters that included Democrats and moderate Republicans. America was united behind a liberal dream, using national laws and federal funds to solve social problems like poverty and prejudice.
Most Americans want a decent home in a decent neighborhood for all, and so do I. Most Americans want an education for every child to the limit of his ability, and so do I.
Johnson's victory convinced him the time had come to finally deliver on his party's most idealistic promise, an all-out war on poverty. He developed plans for what he called the Great Society.
The Great Society rests on abundance and liberty for all. It demands an end to poverty and racial injustice, to which we're totally committed in our time.
LBJ's ideas were noble in sentiment, sweeping in scope, and he put them into action with one innovative social program after another. Head Start, Medicare, VISTA, student loans, an Office of Economic Opportunity, the National Endowment for the Arts. He imagined a better society which would include everyone.
The Great Society was where everybody was educated. Everybody had all the electric power they could use. Everybody had the latest and most modern and most advanced medical care. And everybody had an adequate income. It was about that simple. He used to talk about himself hoping that history would label him the education president. You know, when he sat back and made up dreams about occupying a big place in history, that's how it came out, the education president.
I was at Harvard, which was supposedly the center of anti-Johnson, here's of people who would think Johnson is a big, gross Southerner who picks dogs up by his ears and shows off his appendicitis scar, and isn't he just too vulgar? We didn't feel that way at all. We absolutely worshipped Johnson at the beginning. And the very fact that he was a Texan and vulgar and all that was part of our worship of him. Here was this force of nature. Here was this huge personage that had come to redeem what we believed in. So the betrayal of Vietnam was all the more awful and severe because of how much faith and love, really, we invested in Lyndon Johnson.
The Vietnam War threatened to drain away time, energy, and money needed for Great Society programs. But Johnson and many others of his generation believed there was no choice, that it was necessary to send U.S. troops to thwart a dangerous and advancing enemy: international communism.
The aim of the communists is to establish control over all of Vietnam, and after that, over all of Southeast Asia.
Most Americans feared communist expansion. But from the beginning, the war was distant and confusing to the generation that would have to do most of the fighting.
I don't know. I know why we're there, but I don't know if that's if it's the right decision. But since it is, I'll do my best to whatever has to be done to stop this.
If I were handed a gun and told to go shoot Vietnamese, North Vietnamese, Viet Cong, whoever, that this would be, to me, an immoral action. I don't think I could bring myself to do it.
I don't want to go to Vietnam because I don't want to get killed. If I have to, I will. It works out that way.
Vietnam was colliding with the baby boom. In 1965, the first baby boomers were turning 19, old enough to be drafted, but according to the laws of the time, not yet old enough to vote. There were only a few ways to avoid the draft legally. One was to go to college. That meant college campuses were becoming safe havens for students who would avoid or oppose the war. Although the majority of students supported the action in Vietnam, small groups began mobilizing against it. At the University of Michigan, these students and some of their professors decided to use their skills to teach what they saw as the facts of the situation, that America had involved itself wrongly in another country's civil war. Borrowing techniques they learned in the civil rights movement, they called their rally a teach-in.
Demonstration was called a teach-in because the idea originated with a group of university professors. The consensus of those who taught in from 8 o'clock last evening until 7:30 this morning is simply that the United States must cease the escalation in Vietnam, negotiate a settlement, and/or pull out.
It was the innocent birth of a new political movement.
Nobody had seen anything like it. The whole campus was one mass of people, and they stayed all night, and there was one speech after the other. There were workshops in groups. Telegrams came in, telephones came in from all over the country, from Madison, from Berkeley, from Columbia, from Harvard, you name it. All of the campuses that later on became known as student movement campuses. They said, we will have a teach-in too. This is great. We'll have another one. We'll organize it and so on. And out of that experience came the sense that, yes, you can change the country. If you do it at the right moment, if you do it in the right way, in one night, you can change the country, because that was the reality. The next day, the mood in the country was no longer the same.
In 1965, Phil Oakes was singing about doing what you had to do. And tens of thousands of young people felt what they had to do was protest United States involvement in a war they felt was wrong.
The anti-war movement almost had a spiritual, religious quality to it, if you will. There was a sense of, we're doing something morally wrong. This is wrong. We're killing people for no reason. We're using the incredible might of the American military machine to destroy these people. And there was a sense of almost a lament about what are we doing. It was like a pain. It was more motivated from pain and shame, and wanting to, drawing back on Hitler times and the Nazis. We don't want to be connected with something that's so evil. So there's almost a moral, spiritual, religious quality to it. The black student movement was more in your face. We're sick of you, whitey. You're racist dogs. We want our own dorm. It was much more of a energized, angry.
If the anti-war movement was in its innocent youth, the civil rights movement was entering its cynical middle age.
Why do you think that the black people are demonstrating against the war?
Because more black going over there than any other color.
Black civil rights activists were beginning to jealously guard their control of the movement. They resented the fact that their white allies could never really share the reality of black life.
I live here. This is my community. Of course you live here, but don't you respect the right of black people? Why do you think organize their own march? Right. Don't you? Why do you think I'm here? All right, so why can't you march in the Central Northwest? I'm not going to make any short of it. I'm in the group, but I want to go with you.
Lyndon Johnson had involved America in two wars at once, the war in Vietnam and the war on poverty. Civil rights successes in the South and Johnson's Great Society promises had raised the expectations of the poor. But minority residents of Watts, Bedford-Stuyvesant, Chicago's South Side, and 100 other poverty-stricken urban neighborhoods continued to struggle against unfair odds. Inadequate schools, inflated retail prices, and conspiracies by realtors and bankers to keep blacks from moving into white neighborhoods. When the civil rights struggle came north, it left behind the tightly organized grassroots leadership that had defeated the Jim Crow laws. In the north, there were more complicated economic problems to overcome.
Oh, you have to have your children out here starving with nothing to eat, and you can't even get a job. Now, you just tell me, I mean, what's right?
Black people don't own Harlem, so who gives a damn whether Harlem burns down or not? You're going to tell me the man that's property that inspires me every day. When I was black man in Harlem, works the first Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday for a landlord. And on Thursday, he's working for Ken Edison. And on Friday, he works for himself. And he's got the day off on Saturday, and he buys him a drink of liquor, and the minute he gets drunk, then a white policeman arrests him, puts him in a white coat, and takes his money for 2 other weeks. And he goes in debt for the rest. And he goes to a white landlord, goes to a white pawn shop. And else he goes to another white loan shop to keep living on credit, to pay off the Hoffman. And he's paying taxes and profits and vacations for white people. And all these black men ain't got nothing to lose. And everyone better understand.
To many who lived here, these inner-city neighborhoods seemed like colonies, patrolled by white policemen who acted more like soldiers of an occupying army than upholders of law and order.
Because we have seen the pigs on the scene. We know what he's like. We know what he's capable of. Just being a damn pig, oinking and beating and walking the streets. I'm sick of these damn pigs walking our streets.
Out in the neighborhoods, the police were getting more resistance. Policing a ghetto neighborhood where people had been subservient, now people were standing up to police officers, asserting their rights, talking back. And for many older police officers, this was a new problem. Why don't they behave the way they always did? You know, police officer says, don't do that. Now they were calling police officer Whitey.
We're gonna make Vietnam look like a holiday. Hey!
Listen to me when I make an appeal for the Negroes, because you have no concern for the Negroes. Listen to me when I make an appeal for America. You claim you love America. Well, we love America. But you are driving us back and you are making a Samson out of us, and we are going to pull down the pillars. Should you try to pretend that I'm crazy because I want America to be saved? Is it too much to ask you to grant us human dignity? Should we be put down and shot to death for this request? If so, you can aim your guns. What the hell do you think we care about dying if you're going to deny us the right to live?
From 1964 through 1967, there were 164 inner-city rebellions, from Minneapolis to Tampa, from Boston to Los Angeles. All told, 83 people were killed, almost all of them black, shot or beaten to death by police trying to maintain law and order. Almost 30,000 were arrested. And millions, black and white, saw the smoke and heard the fire engines from their bedroom windows. Most of America had one concern. When was the government going to put an end to it?
Will the fire department get here shortly? They'll try. Hopefully they'll succeed, because next to this block of buildings is now burning the gasoline station.
It was scary. It was scary to watch on television. It was scary to know it was happening. It was scary to know that people were reverting to random violence on their own neighbor's property just because they were so frustrated and so angry that that was the only way they could get it out. There's no solution for something like that. The political process doesn't address that level of emotionalism and that level of anger. And it seemed like the government didn't know what to do either. And that was really scary.
Well, if there's going to be another riot, I want to be prepared. And let me tell you one thing. You better not show his face in front of my house, because if it means my own life, I'd shoot him. Fear is fear, and when you get fear into you, you'll do anything. And I know what fear we had when we look up in the sky and see the sky all illuminated. It wasn't very pleasant.
Last year was pretty bad. I've been thinking about arming myself, my wife. You know, my father, he lives next door to me. He's armed, and I know several other people who've taken the trouble to go and buy a gun. If the city or the government can't stop it, then there's going to be a little trouble in the suburbs or with normal people.
So you didn't miss by much.
There was at least one place in American society where blacks and whites were fighting on the same side. The enemy in Vietnam was proving tougher than anyone had predicted, and LBJ thought he had no choice but to send more troops to reinforce those already there.
Try to picture yourself as president. You've given an order. 4,000 or 5,000 men get killed because of the order you've given. Are you going to say to yourself, I'm not talking now about making propaganda, talking to other people. Are you going to say to yourself, my God, 4,000 or 5,000 men are dead because I was a damn fool? I killed those men? No. You know what you're going to say? You're going to say those men died in a noble cause, and we've got to be sure now that the cause for which they sacrificed is not in vain. So you're going to send 10,000. You get some of those killed, and you're going to send 20,000. Get a big bunch of those killed, you're going to send 40,000.
I have today ordered to Vietnam the Air Mobile Division and certain other forces which will raise our fighting strength almost immediately. Additional forces will be needed later, and they will be sent as requested.
Young men were facing a difficult choice. Become a soldier, which meant maybe killing or being killed abroad, or avoid the war and face ostracism from people who felt it was every man's patriotic duty to defend his country.
You're not men, as far as I'm concerned.
Well, I don't like the war, but I think there's nothing really that we can do about it except go over there and fight.
The war could be avoided legally by obtaining a draft deferment, or illegally by refusing to be drafted or fleeing to Canada.
I had three choices. Come to Canada, go to jail, or go out and fight for something that I'd been protesting against for, better part of 2 years. And Canada seems like a awfully nice jail.
Well, I think it took more guts to come here.
The price of illegal draft evasion was high, several years in jail if you were caught. Nevertheless, a growing minority of young men opposed the war strongly enough to take that risk.
You don't own me. You don't control my life. I'll decide. That's what America's about. I get to decide whether I go or don't go. And they say, no, you got to go. and you'll do this and this and this. And you say, no, no, I still won't. You don't understand. I don't believe in your rules. I don't believe in your rules. I won't obey your rules.
Hell no, we won't go. Hell no, we won't go. Hell no, we won't go.
Draft board offices around the country, where hundreds of thousands were being marched through Army physicals, became the new focal point for protest.
You don't have to go. Please don't go. You can join our lines. You don't have to go. Please don't go. Say no. You don't have to go. You don't have to go. You don't have to go. You don't have to go.
Anybody denies me my right to get up here and get literature that is offered by the United States government because I want it. I want it. I'm the American public, Buster.
That's the American public, all right.
You better believe in it. And what I believe in fighting for. I'm standing here a bunch of uncouth, miserable-looking
barbarians.
You guys stink, you know.
There will be some nervous Nellies, and some who will become frustrated and bothered and break ranks under the strain. And some will turn on their leaders and on their country and on our own fighting men. There will be times of trial and tension in the days ahead that will exact the best that is in all of us. We do not seek to enlarge this war, but we shall not run out of it.
LBJ's remarks made many anti-war activists believe their peaceful demonstrations would be ignored. Some frustrated students decided the time had come to move from protests to active resistance.
I believe that it's now time for new tactics in the anti-war movement to mobilize all the support we can against the war.
It's come to this. There's nothing else to do. The picketing and all of that, which just wasn't working. It's time for confrontation.
Relatively few protesters openly defied the law by burning their draft cards or disrupting the operation of draft induction centers. But it was these people who captured the attention of the country.